The Black Lives Matter protests are in their fourth week. Protesters' demands now include removing statues and monuments they see as symbols of slavery or imperialism. In the UK, a statue of former Prime Minister Winston Churchill has been covered up after protesters dubbed him a racist and tried to remove it. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Sunday called the charge of racism the height of lunacy, warning against attempts to edit or Photoshop the entire cultural landscape. Has the movement gone too far, or is it justice finally being served? Joining our discussion from London via Skype is Professor Iain Begg from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and from Memphis, Tennessee, the US, we are joined by Professor Josef Mahoney from East China Normal University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So as I said, more protesters took to the streets across the US and elsewhere over the weekend. Protests even spill out over into non-Western cultures such as Japan. Professor Begg, why has the BLM movement resonated across the globe, and what is the context of these protests in different countries?
Well, I think one thing to say to begin with is that the striking images that we saw from Minnesota captured the imagination of everybody across the world. But it also chipped into a debate which is already taking place on discrimination and equality in the United Kingdom, as in many other countries. And it's clarified a need to look into this entire question of race, of equality, and of opportunity that's been denied to such a high proportion of our populations.
Why do you think, Professor Begg, that the death of George Floyd has triggered such massive reactions? I mean, we've always had similar demonstrations or movements against racial injustice, inequality, but this time it seems that the soul-searching is particularly massive. What's the difference between this wave and previous ones?
Well, I'd say it's two things. One is simply the image of one policeman kneeling on his neck while three others stand by doing nothing about it, and it going on for so long being recorded. The second is a sense of this time it's enough. It's a bit like the Me Too movement for women when Harvey Weinstein was taken into the prison system because of his misdemeanors. It triggered a much wider wave of revulsion. So it's the coming together of these different forces.
Professor Mahoney, what is your take on these questions? Why do you think this time it has resonated so much? And it's gone broader and it's also gone deeper, right? People started with racial injustice, police brutality against minorities, and then they went and looked further back into history. As I said, they not only looked at the role of Winston Churchill, but as far back as Christopher Columbus.
Well, I think it's part of as our friend at LSC has said, it's related to these conversations that were already taking place, and it does follow the Me Too movement, and it also follows previous activities by Black Lives Matter in the United States. But I think it also has to be examined in the context of this globalized world, the pandemic, and the incredible vulnerabilities that a lot of minorities are facing right now, particularly in the United States with mass unemployment, which is always correlated with mass unrest, and you know, within the context of what many people describe as the emergence of a new world order, where you're having this shift of power from the West, from the white West in particular, to these other regions that were historically subjugated along racial lines. And so I think this is a natural thing that is following, and it's probably a very positive thing, even though it will be painful for all of us in the meantime.
Well, protesters in the United States turned their attention, as I said, to some statues and landmarks that they see as symbols of racism, of slavery, of imperialism. For instance, in West Orange, New Jersey, a monument to Christopher Columbus was hung a sign saying murderer, and another sign below says, "This is a stolen land." Professor Begg, what is being awoken here, or it has always been there, it's just that this time it has, you know, demonstrated itself in more explosive terms. Is it a moment of truth that's long overdue?
difficult, because what's happening is an attempt to say, here is an interpretation of history that you have all been accustomed to, especially people that look like me, being white-skinned, and there's a different interpretation of history, which is colonialism, the adverse consequences of colonialism, the negative implications for Native Americans and others, and that's coming to the fore. It's a difficult balance, because you mentioned statues. One which was assaulted with a paint, with a sign saying racist daubed on it, was Churchill.
Mm-hmm.
Now Churchill, in his day, almost certainly was a racist, was a colonialist. He believed in empire and so on. But these were the norms of 50 or 100 years ago. And the difficult challenge for interpreting this is to say, should we continue to accept Churchill as a historically important figure with a positive overtone, or go back to say, well, Churchill had all these flaws that we need to look at in a different manner. And the same with another previous British Prime Minister, a towering figure of the 19th century, Gladstone. His family was involved in slavery, not him directly. Should his statues come down? The delicate questions that are arising in this context.
Well, some people are saying, of course, you cannot rewrite history, you cannot Photoshop history, but to have those triumphant-looking statues in prominent positions is, in a way, glorifying these figures, and possibly you are teaching, you're forming a kind of impression on young people, children, before they could find out the sophistication of history themselves, that, oh, these are big figures. For instance, Christopher Columbus, for a lot of people, he is the one who's discovered America. You know, he's a great adventurer, did great things. So from that perspective, Professor Begg, is there not a point in the effort by some people to say, okay, we don't rewrite history, but let's find another place for these statues?
Well, certainly there's a line, famous line, that says history is written by the victors. The ones who win are in a much stronger position to be able to say, here's what really happened. And those who are not the victors, who have been the losers of these kinds of conquests or movements, are the ones who are saying, now you must be more nuanced about this. You must recognize that if you look at this through the lens of somebody with a black skin or a descendant of slaves, it's going to be very different from what I, as a white middle-class male, are going to be looking at. So there is a cultural element to this, and I think it has gone beyond just statues. What's striking to me is a number of people who say, yes, statues are an immediate response, but what we really need to do is think more deeply about what lies behind it, why there is a particular interpretation of history, why we don't understand the pain that's been caused to such a high proportion of the population over the centuries.
So what can be done? I mean, okay, let me give this question to Professor Mahoney. Do you see this more profound question being asked? If so, what are you going to do? Because that is almost like, you know, having a re-reckoning of our entire past, because you can find black people or African Americans wanting to write history in a certain way or represented it in a certain way. You have, you know, many other, the Chinese people, you have Indian, you have all kinds of. Professor Mahoney.
Well, I think the first point, and I think this echoes the previous comments, is that although history cannot be changed and it should not be erased, it can and should be corrected. And this is both the narrative of history, which is oftentimes, as he said, the story of the victors, right? But also hagiographic, right? It paints these figures in overly positive lights and gives them incredible influence. And I think you take a figure like Churchill and his iconic status for the Conservative Party, for example, and to what extent does that legacy live on in the white privilege that some people believe is a problem with British conservatives? I don't have a position on that, but I'm saying this is something that some people would be concerned about. So this narrative needs to be contested, and it needs to be contested not only in terms of how it may have been poorly written in the past, but how it continues to inform the present. This is a healthy thing.
Well, I was asking this question from a devil's advocate. Actually, from the Chinese perspective, there are a lot of things that we would like to be rewritten, right, when it has to do with the UK, what the empire, what the British Empire was doing for the Chinese people. But really, how do you do that? I mean, I think
the UK,
yes,
but also Japan.
Of course, but you know, there are so many things. If we look around
Right,
our lives,
not just.
yeah. If we look at our own past, there are also a lot of things where we can say, okay, this was written this way, but probably there could be a nuance as well. So how do you handle that in real life, Professor Begg?
Well, I think we have to take it as a starting point and then try to move on. I'm quite happy to see some of the reactions in the UK to this, in particular the voice of black footballers. What football has got to do with all this? But football has been one of the industries in the UK which has been very dynamic in trying to promote the black players, and a number of them, particularly those in the England football team, have been quite vocal over the last 2 or 3 days, giving their point of view. There was also a very striking image in the papers over the weekend of a very large black man. It turns out he was a personal trainer, rescuing a demonstrator who was from the extreme right, picking up before the crowd killed him. And that image has been across all the press. So I think we can look at some of these positive indications and say there is a mood for change. That mood for change can be translated eventually into policies. You hear Boris Johnson already leaping on that particular bandwagon. So I'm optimistic that this is a window of opportunity.
Professor Mahoney, where do you think we should draw the line, step by step? You know, otherwise, okay, I'm for change here, but people also need to be rational, right? People are not going to resort to violence. Mahoney, how do you look at this? How should this be done? How should such change be carried out?
Well, frankly, you know, we had this another tragedy in Atlanta. We had the first tragedy, and it wasn't the first tragedy, right? It was one of a long line of tragedies in the death of Floyd, and that sparked the unrest and some of the violence. But what was that the political movement or the national organization and the efforts associated with Black Lives Matter came in and they started policing themselves and enforcing nonviolence. But unfortunately, we had the event in Atlanta, and when you have that reaction, as we had in Atlanta, and especially in a city where you have so much African-American power and influence, it's not surprising that that would in turn spark another act of violence. I think the key to remember here is that it's really the police, it's really the authorities that have most of the power, that have the guns. And it's on that side where restraint really needs to be exercised. And some cities have done that well, and some have fallen short. And the tragedy in Atlanta is somewhere in between. So I think the first thing we need to do is stop the violence, particularly on the side of the authorities. And then I think we can move forward in a more civilized way of solutions to these long-standing systemic problems.
Professor Begg, 10 seconds if you may. Where do you see, how do you foresee this movement developing in the near future? Next months, let's say?
I think it's going to be a lot of small gestures, an attempt to bring this narrative into the public debate, and hope that the rather positive attitude of Boris, which I think contrasts with Donald Trump in the US, is one which gives me grounds for hope. If I'm allowed another 2 seconds, there was a wonderful cartoon in one of the newspapers here with a picture of Trump saying, "Orange lives matter."
Let's wait and see. Many thanks to my guests, Professor Iain Begg and Professor Joseph Mahoney. That is it for this edition of The Point with me, Iain. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.